All right, so today we're diving into something pretty fascinating, family business succession. And you shared with me this chapter called Brave Communication as the Key for Successful Family Business Succession.
Right.
And, the title alone definitely got me intrigued.
Yeah, okay.
But then I started looking at the statistics about how many of these businesses actually make it to the second and third generation.
Yeah.
And spoiler alert, not many.
It's a high-stakes game.
Right.
And the numbers really don't lie. Only about 30% of family businesses make it to the second generation.
Wow.
And then a shockingly small 10-15% make it to the third generation.
Wow.
And we're talking the majority of companies worldwide, responsible for trillions and trillions of dollars of economic value.
Yeah.
Yet so few of them
Yeah.
manage to navigate successfully.
The choppy waters of passing the torch.
It's amazing to me, though, when you think about those numbers and why succession is such a hurdle.
Yeah.
Because we often hear about family businesses being very close-knit, driven by their values.
Yeah. But is there something about that dynamic that actually makes this whole process even more challenging?
Yeah, it's a fascinating paradox. Because you're right, these family businesses, they thrive on these very powerful emotions, love, loyalty,
Right.
the sense of shared history. But very often they fall prey to this culture of secrecy.
Really?
These rigid hierarchies, and almost this tendency to avoid conflict
Interesting.
at all costs. And, these patterns then create this fertile ground for misunderstandings, resentment, which can be incredibly destructive when you're trying to make decisions about the future of your company.
Right, because you're talking about some pretty high-stakes stuff, money, power, legacy. I mean, these are emotionally charged topics.
Yeah.
Absolutely, even in the best of circumstances.
Well, sure.
And then this chapter argues that brave communication is the key.
Yes.
And so it's not just about speaking up, is it? It's about shifting the entire family culture towards more openness, vulnerability, empathy.
Grave communication in this context really means daring to be vulnerable.
Okay.
Because you have to acknowledge the elephant in the room, all those unspoken anxieties, all those fears
Yeah.
that are often simmering beneath the surface.
Right.
And you need to address those head on with honesty and with empathy.
So instead of pretending everything's okay,
Right.
we actually have to get real
We do.
about how we're feeling, which
Yeah.
I can imagine for a lot of families feels incredibly risky.
Incredibly risky.
So when we think about the different groups here,
Yeah.
the predecessors, the successors, and then even those family members not directly involved, what are some of the common anxieties that each of those groups tends to face?
Yeah, the chapter does a really good job of outlining those anxieties.
Yeah.
And I think you'll find them surprisingly relatable. So for predecessors who've often poured their heart and soul into building the business,
Yes.
letting go is about so much more than stepping away from a job. It's about grappling with these really big questions of identity, worrying about financial security, and facing this fear of becoming irrelevant.
Wow.
Imagine you've poured your life into something,
Right.
and now you have to hand over the reins.
Right.
Yeah, it's a huge emotional hurdle.
It's almost like saying goodbye to a part of yourself.
Right.
That has been so central to who you are for so long.
It is.
And I can see how for a lot of predecessors, that urge to hold on tightly
Right.
or avoid the conversation altogether
Right.
would be so strong.
Absolutely.
And then on the flip side, you've got the successor
Right.
stepping into these enormous shoes,
Huge.
often having to prove themselves against the legacy of a legend.
Yeah, it's a lot of pressure.
Yeah.
It can be very suffocating.
To live up to those expectations.
Yeah, and also feeling this potential lack of autonomy
Right.
to kind of make your own mark.
So you're kind of caught between this rock and a hard place
You are.
of wanting to honor the past,
Mm-hmm.
but also forge your own path.
Yes.
And then we haven't even talked about the other family members
Oh,
who may
yeah.
feel completely overlooked in this process.
Yeah.
Potentially left out of decision-making.
Yes.
Or even envious
Right.
of the chosen successor.
It's true.
And so all of those feelings,
Mm-hmm.
the confusion, the resentment, the powerlessness, I imagine those only get amplified
I do.
in a culture that avoids direct communication.
Absolutely. And those unspoken emotions don't just disappear.
Right.
They tend to fester and then they resurface,
Yeah.
often in very unhealthy ways. And they damage relationships
Right.
and create further division within the family and within the business.
Yeah. It's a powerful reminder that we often underestimate those unspoken feelings.
Yeah.
But this idea of brave communication. It's not just about, airing all the dirty laundry.
Yeah.
It's about shifting that family culture.
Exactly.
Where it's greater openness, vulnerability, empathy.
Precisely. And that's where the magic happens.
Yeah.
When families can openly discuss these often unspoken anxieties, it strengthens their relationships and in turn strengthens the business. It's counterintuitive, but vulnerability, when met with empathy and understanding, builds trust, and it allows for more constructive decision-making.
So how do we actually bridge that gap between acknowledging those anxieties and then actually having productive conversations about them? Because it's one thing to say, like, vulnerability is important,
right,
but actually putting it into practice feels very daunting.
You've hit on a really crucial point. It's about turning those concepts into action. And the chapter emphasizes the importance of understanding the psychological needs that are underlying these anxieties. So, for example, a predecessor who is worried about their legacy might actually just be craving reassurance that their life's work is going to be valued and continued in some way.
So it's not so much about clinging to control, but a deeper need to feel like all of their efforts weren't in vain.
Yes.
And then a successor who's feeling trapped by those expectations might actually be yearning for
autonomy. Yeah. The freedom to make your own mark.
So it's about recognizing that beneath those anxieties are very human needs for validation, respect, agency.
Absolutely. And once we understand those needs, we can start to communicate in a way that addresses them constructively.
Yeah, I love this. Because it really highlights the importance of empathy and perspective taking.
Absolutely.
Which leads us to this other side of brave communication, which is active listening.
Yes.
And we talk about that term a lot. Right. But what does that actually look like in this context? And how does it go beyond just, hearing the words?
So active listening in this framework is about really absorbing not just the words, but the emotions and the unspoken needs behind what's being said.
Okay.
It's about really putting yourself in the other person's shoes, trying to understand their perspective, even if you don't agree with it, and responding with empathy and respect.
Which is so much easier said than done.
It is.
Especially when we're dealing with such emotionally charged situations. So if our listener is thinking, okay, I get it. Active listening is important. Right. But how do I actually do that? How do I get better at it?
Yeah.
What advice does this chapter offer?
Well, they make a really fascinating connection between active listening and the concept of a growth mindset.
Okay.
You heard of this? This was developed by Carol Dweck.
I have.
Okay. So it's that belief that we can continuously learn and grow and evolve, even and perhaps especially.
Okay.
In the face of challenges and criticism.
So ditching that defensive, I'm always right attitude.
Exactly.
That can sometimes creep in.
Yes. And when we approach these conversations with humility, with a genuine desire to understand the other person's perspective, we open ourselves up to new insights and new possibilities.
And so in the context of family business succession, this would mean shifting from that mindset of scarcity, where it's like, if you gain something, I lose, to a mindset of abundance.
A mindset of abundance, yes.
Can you say a little bit more about that? What does that look like in this setting?
So imagine a family business where different perspectives are viewed not as threats, but as valuable assets. That contribute to a richer, more informed decision-making process. Yeah. So it's not about one person winning or losing. It's about really leveraging that collective wisdom and experience of the entire family to make the best choices for the future.
Which makes a lot of sense. But how do you create that culture where that kind of open, vulnerable dialogue is actually possible?
Yeah.
Because it's easy to just say, oh, we should all share our feelings, but to actually make that happen productively.
Right. It requires a conscious effort, structure, and a real commitment to incorporating these principles into the very fabric of how the business operates.
So it's not just about having a few heart-to-heart conversations. It's about embedding these practices into the DNA of the company.
Yes, exactly.
So what are some examples of how families can actually do this?
Well, the chapter talks about some very specific tools.
Yeah.
And communication strategies. For example, regular family meetings.
Okay.
With a very structured format that encourages open dialogue. And constructive feedback.
Having that dedicated time and structure, I imagine, would be so helpful.
And it can be really helpful.
Especially for families who aren't used to having these sorts of conversations.
Exactly.
But what about those anxieties that people might be hesitant to share, even in a family meeting setting.
Well, that's where things get really innovative. The chapter suggests using things like anonymous surveys.
Oh, interesting.
To give everyone a voice, especially those who might be hesitant to speak up in a more direct setting.
That's brilliant.
Right.
Because it allows people to share their concerns or feedback, knowing that they'll be heard.
Yes.
Without fear of judgment or repercussions.
Exactly.
So you're getting a much more well-rounded perspective that way.
Exactly.
Are there any other tools mentioned?
They also suggest having a feedback advocate.
Okay.
And this is someone whose role is to make sure everyone feels heard and that decisions are made with as much information as possible.
So it's like having a designated listener.
Exactly.
I love that.
Whose job it is to create that space for diverse viewpoints.
Yeah.
And to make sure that those perspectives are actually considered.
What a clever approach.
Right. And then finally, they talk about the value of independent board members.
Okay.
These are individuals outside the family who can offer objective advice and challenge assumptions.
Because sometimes you need that external perspective.
You do.
To really see the bigger picture.
Absolutely.
Like that saying, you can't read the label from inside the jar.
That's a good one.
Right. Sometimes you need that outsider's view.
Absolutely.
And then one more thing that they mentioned that I thought was really powerful was this idea of legacy projects and philanthropic ventures.
Yeah, it's a really powerful way to strengthen those family bonds. Yeah. And create this shared sense of purpose that extends beyond just the day-to-day of the business.
Because it's not just about passing down a business. It's about creating a lasting legacy that future generations can be proud of. And it reminds me of that quote by Maya Angelou. She said, "I've learned that people will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel."
That's beautiful.
And these legacy projects, they have the power to create a legacy of shared purpose, and meaning that can transcend generations.
Beautifully said. When families can connect around these shared values, this common vision for the future, it creates such a powerful foundation for navigating these complexities of succession and ensuring that that business thrives for generations to come.
It does, and actually the chapter highlights two contrasting case studies that I think really vividly illustrate the potential consequences of these different communication styles within family businesses.
Okay.
So one case involves a French industrial family business, and in this case, the predecessor, despite his initial reluctance to step down, actually found the courage to express his vulnerabilities to his family.
Okay, so what did that look like? What did he actually say? So he gathered his family together, and he admitted that stepping away from the business was much harder than he anticipated.
Wow.
He confessed his fears of irrelevance, his desire to still feel useful, and his struggle to fully trust his successor.
Wow.
Even though he knew logically it was the right thing to do.
That takes courage.
It does.
Especially for someone who's used to kind of leading from that position of strength.
Absolutely.
So what was the family's response when he opened up like that?
His vulnerability? His willingness to express those anxieties openly and honestly. It created a space for genuine connection.
Interesting.
His successor, instead of feeling burdened by his father's presence, felt empathy and a deeper understanding of what he was going through.
Wow.
And this paved the way for a slower, but ultimately more successful transition.
It's amazing how vulnerability can almost become its own strength.
It can.
Right.
It's counterintuitive.
By being open about his fears, he actually strengthened those family bonds.
It did.
And created a more resilient foundation for the business to grow. So I'm curious about the contrast.
Yeah.
When those lines of communication break down, what happens then?
Yeah, so they contrast this French family story with a more tragic case of a family business that was torn apart by years of unaddressed conflict.
Oh, wow.
So this family operated under this don't talk, don't trust, don't feel kind of culture.
Wow.
Believing that avoiding difficult conversations was the best way to keep the peace.
Just sweeping it all under the rug.
Exactly.
Hoping it'll magically disappear.
Hoping it would just go away.
Yeah.
And as we know, those unspoken issues rarely stay buried.
Right.
They tend to resurface, often with a vengeance, at the worst possible time. And in this case, those suppressed anxieties and resentments, they fueled this really bitter power struggle.
Yeah.
During the succession process,
oh no,
family members were pitted against each other. Their decisions were clouded by years of mistrust and resentment.
It's heartbreaking.
It is.
To think about a family legacy.
Yeah, generations of hard work.
All put at risk.
All at risk.
Because they couldn't communicate.
And it's interesting because in this case, the family waited until the stakes were incredibly high to try to address all these years of unspoken issues.
Right.
And by then, it was sadly too late.
Yeah.
The conflict escalated to the point where they were actually forced to sell the company.
Wow.
So it led to a tragic loss, not just financially, but emotionally for this family.
Well, this has been an incredible deep dive.
Yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
We went from these daunting statistics
It's true.
to the psychological complexities.
Yeah.
We unpacked this idea of brave communication, of expressing our own vulnerabilities, but then also actively listening to the needs and perspectives of others.
It's so important.
And then even some practical tools that families can use to navigate this transition successfully.
Yes.
So much good stuff here.
Yeah, a lot to unpack.
It really makes you think.
It does.
About how we can apply these principles, not just in family businesses, but in our own lives.
In all our relationships, for sure.
So whether it's navigating a difficult conversation with a colleague, or resolving conflict within our own families, or just being more attuned to the unspoken anxieties of those around us, this idea of brave communication offers such a powerful framework for building stronger, more resilient relationships.
It really does.
It's about bridging that gap between us, one honest conversation at a time.
Beautifully said.
Well, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.